In this week's Technique Tuesday, I will demonstrate how to knit in your yarn tails when you join a new ball of yarn. As always, if you'd like to jump to a specific point in the video, there are direct links down in the description. When you're finishing one ball of yarn and need to join a new ball of yarn, there are two basic ways of dealing with the yarn tails. One is to let the old tail and the new tail hang and then weave them in when you are finished knitting using a yarn needle. The other is to eliminate the tails when you join the new ball of yarn so that you don't have to weave them in later. Today I'll demonstrate the simplest method of eliminating those tails, and I'll explain the advantages and disadvantages. So let's get started. I've come to a point in my row where I'm just about out of yarn in one ball of yarn, and so I need to join a new ball of yarn in the same color. So the way I'm going to do that is by overlapping. This is the new yarn, so this is the end of the new yarn, and here is the end of the existing yarn. So I'm going to overlap them in this direction. I'm going to work them together for, I don't know, 5 or 6 stitches. So you're going to have a little bit of the new tail just dangling down, and you're going to work with both yarn tails. Now I'm going to show using continental method with the yarn in my left hand, but then I'll switch to the yarn in my right hand and show you how to do that. So I want to keep the tension on the new ball of the yarn tail of the new ball. So I'm going to just hold it against the needle in my right hand so that I have tension in both yarn tails. So now I knit them together. Now what I'm doing is I'm essentially knitting with a strand of yarn that's twice as thick as the original ball of yarn. So I want to try to keep my tension a little bit snug. This affects the new stitches that are being created on the needle when I'm working firmly. So I'm going to work 5 or 6 stitches. I want to work firmly. So now I've worked 5 stitches, and you can see that each of these stitches is made up of 2 strands of yarn. So it's important to remember that this is each one stitch. Those are not 2 stitches, those are each 1 stitch. At this point, I can just drop the yarn tail of the old ball of yarn and continue working with just the new ball of yarn. You're going to overlap the 2 yarns in the opposite direction. You're going to give yourself a little bit of extra tail to hold on in your left hand, just to provide some tension. So you can just hold that against the left needle in your hand like this while you prepare to knit with the other 2 yarns in your right hand. So then you can knit them together like this. Again, you're holding the tail of the new yarn in against your left needle just to provide some tension for the first few stitches. So now I've come to the point where I'm about to work the stitches that have 2 strands of yarn. So I've got one more stitch that's just a single strand, and then these are all double strands. So I want to make sure that when I work them, that I'm working them as one stitch and that I'm not working them separately. So again, I want to make sure I take out any excess slack. These stitches might end up taking up more room and being spaced further across on the needle. I want to keep themselves further apart on the needle than a standard stitch would. So I want to make sure that I'm not working these stitches too loosely, otherwise it will affect the gauge in the row above. So at this point, you can see this is one of the yarn tails. I can pull on it a little bit. There's a little bit of extra slack in that one. And I can look to see if there's any in this one. This one seems to be okay. So now you can see on the back of the work that the stitches that were doubled have double heads. They have 2 strands of yarn forming the purl bumps on the back of the work. And on the front of the work, because I worked with some firmness but not too much firmness, these stitches are all pretty even in size. You can see a little bit here where you can see 2 strands of yarn forming the leg of some of the stitches. It's a pretty satisfactory join if you don't have another way to join one end of the ball to another by avoiding tails altogether. So you do still have these tails on the back. They don't need to be woven in though. They just need to be trimmed. You can trim them 1/4 to 1/2 inch away from the surface of the fabric, and they'll be hanging there, but they'll be securely woven in as you knit. So let's say you need to join a new ball of yarn, but the new ball of yarn is a different color. Then what would you do? You don't want to do this overlapping trick and working at the same time. You don't have a lot of control over which color is going to show in the front. So here's the point where I began working with both blue and green, and you can see I have a stitch that's sort of half blue, half green, then I have one that looks blue, and then I have one that looks mostly green, and then I have one that looks green, and then I dropped the green and worked only with the blue. So that isn't really a good option. There is an option if you're switching to a new color that will eliminate one of the tails later so that you won't have to weave in with a yarn needle later. And that I'm going to show you now. So I've worked a few stitches of green. I'm ready to work the blue. And so what I want to do is link the blue yarn around the green yarn. So I'm going to link it like this so that I have a few inches, like 3 or 4 inches of overlap like this. So the 2 yarns are going to be linked like that. So the green, I'm going to be keeping tension on the green in against my yarn needle while I hold these 2 in my left hand. So I have tension on both the green and the blue. And now I can work. And again, I want to work with a reasonably firm tension. So I don't want this to be loose because again, I'm working with 2 strands at the same time. Then after I've worked 4 or 5, I can drop that extra strand of blue and just let it hang on the back. And then I can continue knitting with it. The tension is pretty good here. Again, you can kind of see the 2 stranded legs of these stitches, and it does look pretty good. So you still have 2 tails on the back. This one you can trim here because that one is woven in. This one has not been woven in, so you will have to weave this one in some way. You're going to link the 2 yarns together like this. And you're going to hold the old color against your left needle like this, and then you're going to knit together. You're going to knit the tail and the working yarn end of the new yarn using your right hand. Knitting in the yarn tails as you work your project can reduce the number of tails you'll need to weave in at the end of your project, but it won't eliminate all of them. By knitting in the tails, the tail follows the path of a row of knitting, allowing it to stretch with the knitted fabric, which helps to prevent the tails from popping through to the front of the work. This is the same advantage you get when weaving in the tail using reverse duplicate stitch. Knitting in is a faster way to get the same endpoint as reverse duplicate stitch, but the disadvantage is that you can sometimes see both yarn strands on the right side of the work. If your project is reversible, you may want to choose a technique that will physically join the 2 tails so that they become one continuous strand rather than knitting them in. Joining the 2 ends means that there will be no visible tails on either side of the fabric. For feltable animal fibers, the felted join is an excellent choice for this, but other options exist as well, such as the woven join and the Russian join. If you are working flat with a decorative selvage stitch at the edge, joining a new ball away from the edge will allow the decorative edge to be maintained with no interruption. If you are knitting flat but will be seaming the edges later, joining the new ball of yarn at the edge is actually a really good idea. You can then bury the tails in the seam where they will be completely hidden. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.